Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of the China program seminars for the winter quarter. Unfortunately, we're again going to be on Zoom thanks to COVID, but a silver lining is that it'll allow us to more easily get top speakers from around the globe and around the country. And so for this winter quarter, we've got a great lineup. And just to give you a sense of what's coming up, our next, right after the beginning of the Year of the Tiger on February 2nd, we have Jim Millward going to talk to us about Xinjiang and giving us an update of what's happening now and what does it mean. In addition to special series such as seminars such as the one that Jim is going to be giving, each quarter we also feature a special theme. And for this winter quarter, we're going to be talking about the future of China's economy. And I think that most of you know that a number of developments have emerged in China, some of which are some would be quite worrying. And among those, one are the troubles in China's real estate sector, particularly the company Evergrande. And this is very important because of the outsized role that real estate plays in China's economy. And what will be the impact as this sector is facing problems. And relatedly, there's also the continuing and growing problem of local government debt. How is it that this debt has grown so large, and what's going to be the impact, including of the downtrend in the property sector, as well as for COVID. And then more broadly, we're going to be looking at the essentially the health of China's fiscal sector, what's happened to banks and other assorted financial institutions. In addition to that, we also know that there's been a resurgence of the state control in the economy and a crackdown on the private sector. But one of the questions that I think it's worth discussing is, does it still make sense to talk about a sharp distinction between the state and private sector? Is there more sort of a merging of both the state into the private sector? And so these are some of the themes that the China program will be exploring for this quarter. And I encourage you to go to our website and to see the details and the specific dates. For today, I am very delighted to begin our series with a discussion of the property sector, and specifically Evergrande, the largest, one of the largest, I think it's the second largest of the property companies in China, and it has been in the news almost daily for the last few months. And so we're very fortunate to have Dinny McMahon, who is the author of a great book called China's Great Wall of Debt. And he is going to be talking to us about, the challenges posed by Evergrande's decline, and what this might mean, and also trying to make some sense of what Beijing is doing by clamping down on the private sector. Let me just say a few words about him. In addition to this book that I just mentioned, he started out his career as a financial journalist in China. He started out with Dow Jones Newswire in Shanghai, and then where he also, I guess, contributed to the Far Eastern Economic Review, and then moved to Beijing to work with the Wall Street Journal itself. And then he was at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where he wrote his book, China's Great Wall of Debt, and then spent some time at the Paulson Institute. And he's currently back at the Wilson Center working on a project for them on China's efforts to reduce its reliance on the US dollar. And so without taking up more time, I'm going to turn it over to Dinny. But the way we're going to operate is that Dinny will speak for about between 30 and 35 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A. And I hope that, and I encourage you to submit questions for in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And then I will curate the questions and post them to Dinny. And so with that, Dinny, I turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Jane. Thanks for having me. So Evergrande. Evergrande has captured global attention because of this idea that its default would precipitate some sort of Lehman Brothers moment. Well, last month, the ratings agencies declared that Evergrande was formally in default after it failed to pay the interest it owed on some US dollar denominated bonds on time, and nothing happened. The analogy of the Lehman moment was always imperfect. China's financial system works in a way that makes the dynamics of a Lehman-like collapse unlikely, if not impossible, partly because financial institutions aren't interconnected in China to the same degree as they are in the United States, and also because of the willingness and the ability of China's financial regulators to directly intervene in the financial markets. But underlying the idea of the Lehman moment is a question that still hasn't really been answered. Specifically, what do Evergrande's problems mean for China's financial system? And more broadly, what does the inability of the world's most indebted developer to pay its bills, what does that mean for China's economy? And that's what I want to talk about today. Because even though what is happening in China's property sector is now about much more than just Evergrande, Evergrande is still at the very center of what's going on. Focus has moved off Evergrande somewhat over the last couple of months, but it's become clear that Evergrande isn't about to crash the system. And secondly, that the problems facing China's property sector go way beyond Evergrande. In fact, Evergrande is the symptom of much greater forces at work rather than the root cause. That said, I'd like to start with Evergrande. Now, investors have been predicting Evergrande's imminent demise for at least a decade. The company had a reputation for financial engineering, which has allowed it to expand and stay afloat well beyond what might otherwise have been possible. Additionally, it has diversified into a bizarre array of unrelated businesses: electric vehicles, bottled water, online car sales. It has an amusement park, areas in which it really has no business being involved. So its problems weren't a surprise, but they mattered because Evergrande is so big. It has about $300 billion worth of debt, and it has more than 1,200 projects around the country. Evergrande's irrevocable downward slide really slipped into public view around April last year, when some of its suppliers and contractors started complaining very vocally and publicly about not getting paid. From there, it defaulted on wealth management products it had sold to people, primarily its own staff, and construction stopped on hundreds of its projects for lack of funds. And while it managed to avoid defaulting on its bonds for months, often coming up with cash at the very last permissible moment, it finally defaulted in December. Although what that means for its restructuring is an open question. However, for all of this, Evergrande's reckoning was precipitated by the government, and specifically by policy measures introduced in August 2020 that were designed to deleverage the property sector. Those measures, the measures established three red lines, what have come to be referred to as three red lines, three different measures of debt that developers are not permitted to exceed. Specifically under these rules, developers aren't permitted to have a liability to asset ratio of 70% or more. They're not permitted to have a net gearing ratio of more than 100%. And they're required to have sufficient cash to cover their short-term borrowings. If, however, a developer violates all three red lines, it isn't permitted to increase the amount that it borrows. If a developer violates two of the three red lines, then it's permitted to increase its debt a little, and so forth. Now, Evergrande was in violation of all three red lines, and that's why things fell apart. Evergrande was so indebted that it needed to borrow just to meet its interest payments on existing loans. So all of a sudden, it was being told that that was no longer an option. Instead, it had to pay its debts from the revenue being generated by its businesses. And that, as it turned out, wasn't enough. For about 8 or 9 months, it managed to get by with various workarounds. Specifically, it conserved cash by deferring payments to its suppliers and contractors. But eventually, even that wasn't enough, and the wheels started to fall off. Now, Evergrande isn't the only developer to have been hit hard by the rules. There have been other defaults, but Evergrande was so big that its problems inevitably raised the question, what does this mean for China's financial system? And the short answer is very little, and I'll explain why in a moment. However, what's become clear is that Evergrande is a symptom of Beijing's efforts through its three red line policy to restructure the real estate sector and fundamentally diminish its contribution to economic growth. And that's going to have a huge impact on the pace of growth over the next few years. Additionally, it will shape how China grows, and it will affect how people in China store their wealth, and it will significantly increase the volume of bad assets or non-performing loans held by the banks. Again, it's not something that will likely precipitate a crisis, but it will complicate life for the banks and for regulators trying to keep the economy on an even keel. So what does Evergrande mean for China's financial system? Firstly, Evergrande, pardon me, Evergrande has a bunch of different creditors. It's borrowed money from banks, from trust companies, people who bought its wealth management products. You have suppliers and contractors who haven't been paid for the work they've done. And you have ordinary home buyers, people who have paid in advance for housing that Evergrande has yet to finish building. Now, this last point is a major source of funding for all of China's developers and has grown in importance in recent years as Beijing cracked down on shadow banking. In short, as developers have been able to borrow less from shadow banking sources, they've relied more on these pre-sales for funding. About 90% of housing in China is sold prior to completion, with home buyers typically putting up between 20% and 30% of an apartment sale price as a down payment. But anyway, back to that list of creditors. The banks, the trusts, the wealth management products, the pre-sales, they're all going to get treated differently. Now, firstly, the authorities want to ensure that these home buyers get their apartments and that small businesses, the suppliers and the contractors that have done work for Evergrande, that they get paid what they're owed. That means that authorities are doing everything in their power to ensure that existing projects started by Evergrande get finished. That means selling off projects to other developers who can finish them, which has the added advantage of Evergrande getting cash that it needs to finish the projects that it can't sell. However, selling projects is proving difficult, not just for Evergrande, but for other distressed developers as well, because relatively more healthy developers aren't willing to buy projects because it means taking on more debt. And they're worried about coming up against the constraints imposed by the three red lines. The PBOC, the China's central bank, has recently been spreading the word that it's relaxing the rules a little, and that debt used to do M&A for buying developers' projects, that won't be counted against the developers' three red lines. However, whether that's enough to get the ball rolling is an open question. Conceivably, the most likely solution is that even with the exception for M&A, it will be state-owned developers rather than private sector firms who will be stepping in as a white knight to buy up projects from Evergrande and from other distressed developers. My guess is that it will be mainly local governments mobilizing their state-owned developers and perhaps other SOEs as well to buy Evergrande's projects to ensure that local residents get their homes and that half-finished development sites don't turn into permanent eyesores. However, not all projects will be worth buying. Some of Evergrande's projects will be so heavily indebted, from bank loans, pre-sales to home buyers, unpaid bill to suppliers, that there is no economic value left in it for somebody to come in and acquire it. These projects will ultimately remain on Evergrande's books. Eventually, at the end of the restructuring process, I think it's fair to expect that a strategic investor, most likely some state firm owned by either the Shenzhen or Guangdong provincial government, will take over whatever remains of Evergrande and inject sufficient capital to allow the company to complete its existing projects and then potentially to start new ones as well. But that will only happen once unsecured unsecured debt holders, which will predominantly be people investors who hold Evergrande bonds, once they take a significant haircut on their investment. What happens to the banks, however, is a little more uncertain. Now, if Evergrande was liquidated tomorrow, senior secured creditors, now that's primarily the banks and trusts, they would ultimately get paid in full. Banks in China typically lend residential housing developers no more than 70 renminbi for every 100 renminbi that developer puts up as collateral, which means that even under fire sale conditions, banks should be able to recoup the entire value of their loans from selling the underlying security. Trust companies typically demand even more collateral. So even in case of default, the banks and the trusts should get their money back. It will probably take a couple of years as the claims work their way through the courts and the assets are liquidated, but at the end of the day, they should get their money. However, the authorities don't want Evergrande to be liquidated. They want it to complete its projects. So the authorities have already told banks to hold off on enforcing their collateral claims. So what's likely to happen is that senior secured creditors, like the banks and the trusts, they have lent to projects that remain, those that have lent to projects that remain part of Evergrande's rump will ultimately be asked to restructure their debt. That will involve extending the maturity on their loans, perhaps in exchange for partial repayment up front, as well as a short-term moratorium on interest payments. Some banks, most likely those with the greatest exposure to Evergrande, might also come under pressure to swap some of that debt for equity in the restructured company. So the reality is that for some banks, some banks are going to have to take a hit, regardless of how well their loans are collateralized. But the whole process will be stage managed by the authorities to ensure that no single bank is asked to do more than it can, or if it must, then it has access to some sort of state support. Shengjing Bank and Minsheng Bank are the likely candidates for potentially experiencing an outsized hit from their exposure to Evergrande, but any fallout is unlikely to be sudden, but rather closely managed by regulators. Moreover, there is no mechanism for distress to spread around the system in the way that it did during the Lehman crisis. Now, it's worth noting here that 6 or 7 years ago, things were very different. In its financial stability report in 2016, when China's shadow banking system was very much at its peak, the IMF said that China's financial system had become so complex and opaque and interconnected that if there was some sort of liquidity or credit event in the system, despite the best intention of the central bank to intervene, it might not be able to on an adequate scale or in the right way or place in which it would be able to prevent contagion from spreading throughout the whole system. Now, that's no longer the case. Since 2016, China's financial regulators have been pursuing this deleveraging campaign through which they've gradually dismantled the shadow banking system such that the potential for contagion to hop from bank to bank is minimal. And the authorities have now have a very proven ability to intervene as needed. However, what's worth mentioning, that's worth mentioning because even though the potential for contagion inside the financial system is greatly diminished from what it was a few years ago, we are seeing other contagion effects from Evergrande's problems that are exacerbating the challenge posed to developers by the 3 red lines. The first is in the offshore dollar bond market. China's developers have raised huge amounts of money by issuing dollar-denominated bonds offshore. However, not only has the price of Evergrande's bonds plunged, but so have the dollar bonds of nearly all of China's other private sector developers. That means that if they want to issue new bonds, the interest rate they have to pay investors is prohibitively expensive. That's causing all sorts of complications for developers. But the short version is that a major source of funding has just been shut off to them. The developers will ultimately try to replace that with onshore funding, but still, that's not going to be a seamless process. However, the biggest risk when we're talking contagion, and certainly the hardest to mitigate, is the impact that Evergrandes woes may be having on the willingness of would-be homebuyers to pay for their apartments in advance of completion. That's an incredibly important source of funding for all Chinese developers. And the risk is that the Chinese public becomes unwilling to prepay for housing being built by developers that could potentially be the next Evergrande, because there's no way of knowing whether the home they buy will be delivered on time, assuming it gets delivered at all. Now, this already seems to be happening. Many of China's weaker developers have failed to hit their 2021 sales targets by a fairly wide margin. Now, the net effect of this dynamic is not dissimilar to a slow motion bank run. Rather than depositors withdrawing funds from a bank, however, households decline to make funds available to China's weakest developers, thereby reducing their financial resources and precipitating the very defaults they're worried about. Now, that's the first order effect, that home buyers become wary of getting caught up with the next Evergrande. The second order is even more dangerous. The reason developers are able to sell apartments 1 or 2 years out from completion is because in China, housing prices always go up. So would-be home buyers are faced with the conundrum. They can buy a house now and wait for it to be completed. So they make a down payment, but they still got 1 or 2 years before they can actually move in. Or they can buy it in 1 or 2 years and pay more for it. Why? Because housing prices always go up. In that intervening 1 or 2 year period, the market price will have increased. Pre-sales have been a way for home buyers to lock in a lower price, and developers have taken advantage of that by using pre-sales to partially fund construction. However, what happens when buyers are less certain that prices are going to go up? Or even worse, what happens when they expect prices to fall? Under those circumstances, developers will struggle to sell in advance of completion, and a key part of their funding model dries up. And I think it's fair to say we're in a moment at the moment where we're sort of in a moment in the market's development where it doesn't look so inconceivable anymore that long-term expectations of prices might actually start to decline. And certainly that this is something that the government is keen to stave off. So what is currently happening in China's property sector? Well, developers are already selling far fewer apartments. In fact, in December, sales of newly built homes were 20% lower than a year earlier. It also means that it also means lower housing prices. And we're seeing that most clearly already in the market for existing housing stock. And developers are beginning construction on fewer new apartments. Again, in December, there was a 31% decline in the number of new construction projects being started compared to a year earlier. And that means, you take all that and put it all together, that means slower economic growth. Real estate is at the heart of China's economy, supporting as much as 30% of GDP. But in addition to the economic activity generated by construction and demand for materials, housing also accounts for a major part of household wealth, thereby supporting consumers' willingness to spend, a willingness to consume. And property and housing is the security, the collateral held against at least half of all bank loans. So in many ways, real estate is central not just to growth, but to how China's economy works. However, housing has become unaffordable for vast portions of the population. The construction boom has created investment properties that people will never live in, and millions of apartments sit unoccupied throughout the country. Moreover, this model of growth is no longer sustainable. It works when you have a young, growing, upwardly mobile workforce, And that was China's story for most of the reform era. Up until the mid-90s, China's urban housing stock was state-owned. There was no privately owned housing. Housing was allocated by state employers, and it was woefully inadequate, both in size, availability, and quality, because the state, both state firms and government agencies, had massively underinvested, because there wasn't any real reason to do so. There were plenty of better ways, more pressing ways for these institutions, which were also responsible for the education and medical care of their workforce, in addition to production. There was just so many more pressing ways for them to invest scarce resources. Now, housing reform in the late 90s did two key things. It allowed housing to be built and owned privately, and it allowed state employees to buy their homes from their state employers at heavily subsidized prices. That allowed them to sell those apartments at a market price, delivering an instant windfall and giving them the resources to buy somewhere better. And that kicked off a housing boom that lasted more than 20 years. A boom that was driven by A, people upgrading their houses to something better, not once, but multiple times. B, young people buying a home to start a family. And crucially, C, people moving from the countryside to the cities, driving the fastest pace of urbanization anywhere in history. In short, demand for new housing was huge and it was unrelenting. But those forces are petering out. What once seemed like an endless flow of people from farm to city turned out not to be so endless after all. For the most part, the countryside has already hollowed out of all the young, able-bodied people who are ever likely to make the move to the cities. So many villages around the country are filled with children and the retirees that take care of them. Meanwhile, China's working age population peaked about a decade ago. Instead, China now has one of the fastest aging populations in the world. Meanwhile, the pace at which new children are being born has slowed to a crawl. Consequently, China's total population is about to start shrinking if it hasn't already. In this demographic environment, having the housing construction sector drive the economy is a liability. China doesn't need more and more homes to be built every year, more built this year than the previous, which is the definition of growth. To the extent that demand continues to grow, it's because one of the drivers of housing demand over the past decade has been investment. Rather than buy stocks and bonds, people buy multiple investment properties. And rather than rent out those apartments, Chinese investors are just as likely to leave them empty and realize the capital gains rather than rental income. Now, unquestionably, there are some cities where there is a legitimate housing shortage, places like Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen. In Beijing, you still find, or at least you did as recently as a few years ago, tiny slums dotted around the city on vacant plots. Meanwhile, construction workers who are building in China, they live in tents on site. And you've got hundreds of thousands of people apparently living in windowless underground utility rooms and other facilities. In cities that are still attracting people, there is a genuine need for affordable quality housing. But elsewhere, China is overbuilt and growth is artificially inflated by demand from households buying investment properties. So that's why Beijing is trying to rein things in. Consequently, economic growth is going to be slower in the years ahead because this is unquestionably a multi-year undertaking. The trick for regulators is ensuring that it is an orderly unraveling and that things don't get out of hand. And that's where things will be tricky. Already there's a sense that the degree of distress among developers has been greater than the central bank perhaps anticipated. And it's introduced a raft of measures to make it easier for developers to get credit over the last couple of months. But even here, it's trying to thread a needle. Beijing wants to ensure that there's sufficient liquidity available to ensure developers' bills get paid, but not enough to reflate the property sector. Of course, it's a mystery where that magic point might be, but that's the game regulators will be playing for the next few years. However, there are potential knock-on effects that might prove more difficult to manage, specifically for local governments. Local governments are dependent on land sales to repay the massive amount of debt they've accumulated to support the construction of new infrastructure projects. Now, local governments are already financially overstretched, something that's been exacerbated by COVID with a raft of tax cuts which have been introduced to stimulate the economy. But this weakness in the property sector is now going to make it much harder for them to sell land. In fact, those difficulties have already started. The volume of land sold by local authorities at auctions in the second half of last year was well down on the previous round of auctions. Now, the problem here is twofold. First, as housing prices fall and sales fall, developers start fewer new projects, which means they need less land. Second, now when a developer wants to buy more land, it has options. It can buy some from a local government, as it always has, or it can buy from some other developer that's in distress or has defaulted or is just trying to get compliant with the 3 red lines. And that developer is probably willing to sell at a discount. So we're potentially looking at a situation where local government finances deteriorate rapidly. Of course, the central government wants to introduce a property tax, but that's a partial solution at best. In Shanghai, which has been trialing a property tax for years, revenues account for only about 10% of the amount of land sales. So there's no easy answer here, and I'm not sure that what the authorities intend to do about it, short of Beijing partially bailing out the local authorities and the banks writing off a big chunk of local government debt. But even that's not really a solution, because that's incredibly expensive, because it would require massively recapitalizing the banks. And the question is, where does that money come from? So that's where we stand today. Evergrande will be gradually restructured and sold off for parts, as will any other developers who run into similar problems. The economy will slow, but that's by design, because it's in the interests of more sustainable long-term growth under radically different demographic conditions. The challenge is for regulators to manage the slowdown with a minimum of defaults and financial instability and people losing their houses. But the biggest challenge might be the knock-on effects of local governments, who will likely see a big drop in revenue, further exacerbating their financial stress. As for the financial system, there's little chance of an immediate financial crisis, but the slowing economy and mounting bad loans will certainly complicate life for the banks. Anyway, I think I'll leave my prepared comments here and throw it back to Jean, and if anyone has any questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dinny. That was you threw a lot at us. But before I get into the questions, a question came in early that I think it would be helpful if you could just answer this question. So the first question that came in is, what is shadow banking? So this is an extremely complicated thing. So please, why don't you just give to make sure that everybody's on the same page. I think that's very important to get clear. And then we'll come into some other questions.
Okay, first to give a bit of historical context. Up until the global financial crisis, or even as late as 2009, China's financial system was in large part the banks. So the way that credit was created in China's financial system, it was created by banks, and the banks then proceeded to extend credit predominantly to state-owned firms. However, starting in late 2009, 2020, what you had was the development of what has been called the shadow banking system. Now, the way to best understand it is it's kind of an ecosystem of non-bank financial institutions which help banks get around restrictions on bank credit creation. So what I mean by that is that the way that the government has traditionally managed the banks is by imposing quarterly quotas on how much they can lend. There's also a whole lot of other restrictions, such as, traditionally banks have only been able to lend out 75% of their deposit base. And then there's been other, and then there's routinely restrictions on how much banks can lend to the property sector or to heavy polluting industries. So the long and the short of it is that the government has traditionally limited credit creation by fiat. It has imposed a whole lot of administrative barriers on bank behavior, and that has limited credit creation. What shadow banking existed, really, it existed for the banks to come up with creative ways to get around those restrictions. And so it would be a way for the banks to cooperate with a trust company, or bank to cooperate with a securities firm to continue extending credit to bank clients in a way that didn't turn up as a formal loan on the bank's balance sheet. So that's the kind of the way to think about it. It's not a parallel banking system. It is a tool that the banks use to get around regulatory limits on how much they can lend.
Mm-hmm. Also, would you agree that actually there are instances where the banks are working with local governments, and particularly with these what are called the local government financing platforms that were issuing bonds, the instances where the banks would help these financing vehicles sell some of these bonds?
Yes, I mean the way that the local governments raised funds were, at the peak there were myriad ways that they were trying to raise capital, raise credit. Certainly one way was through bonds. The banks also helped issue wealth management products on their behalf. They cooperated with trust companies to extend loans to local governments, and then the banks effectively brought those loans back onto their books, but they didn't appear as loans, they appeared as financial assets. There were so many different permutations of what shadow banking looked like that towards the peak, I mean, it was almost impossible to keep track of just how many different forms of permutations there were. And the central bank itself started referring to these things as Russian, some of the more advanced and complicated versions of this as Russian nesting dolls, because there was kind of layer upon layer of complexity that was deliberate, because the institutions designing this credit were doing it to sort of hide or sort of get around various levels of regulations, and to hide the actual, the identity of the end borrower from regulators, because it was in flagrant violation of the spirit of regulations. So yeah, I mean, that kind of gives you an idea of just how complex things got at the end of the day.
Definitely.
But by 2016, end of 2016, the worm had turned. The regulators finally managed to kind of get a handle on this. And shadow banking, I think it's fair to say, really peaked in the first quarter of 2018. There's been in constant decline since then.
Okay. Let me start out by asking a question. And some of the questions that came in, I think, essentially are in this direction. And that is that you were talking about the consequences of the default on the Evergrande bonds and other property companies. And so that one of the real consequences is that the foreign bondholders, they were the ones that really got hit, right? And so that because of that, the cost of other bonds plunged. And so could you go into more detail on that? So essentially, you have a situation where the offshore dollar bonds, I think is what you're calling them. So they're the ones that, like, how much loss did they take? And was there any recourse in this?
Okay, so what's happening there's a couple of things happening in the offshore dollar bond market. So at the moment, you've had a small handful of developers that have just outright defaulted on their dollar bonds. A developer called Fantasia, I think one called Cynic Modern Land, Now, these are now going to go through a sort of a restructuring process. Now, it's an open question at the moment as to how much the offshore bond holders will get back. But of course, what complicates this is that even though they've so far only defaulted on their offshore dollar bonds, the real problem is that these developers are really quite distressed. And so although they've defaulted on their dollar bonds, we can kind of expect things are going to get more and more difficult for them onshore as well. And so you would imagine any sort of resolution for offshore dollar bond holders will kind of have to sort of be wrapped up in some sort of onshore solution as well. Now, the reason why we're seeing instances where the dollar bond holders, the offshore dollar bond holders, are the ones that get defaulted on before anybody else, is really because of a quirk of the system, right? So Chinese developers have issued a huge amount of dollar bonds. A lot of them are very, for them, it's a very important part of their sort of model of funding. But the problem is, for most Chinese developers, they don't actually need dollars. They're only issuing dollar-denominated bonds because they're relatively cheap. It's a cheap source of funding. It's a way for them to diversify their funding. But they raise these dollars. They don't actually need dollars. They're not paying anybody in dollars. They're not making dollar investments. And so those dollars then have to be changed into renminbi. So when it comes time to repay those dollar bonds, they don't actually have a source of dollar revenue. They don't. It's not that they have developments in Las Vegas or San Francisco, which is throwing off rents in dollars, or they're selling apartments there. No, they have no dollar revenue, which means that they have to go through a very Byzantine sort of dollar renminbi to dollar conversion process, which is approved by the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. Now, on the mainland, for example, when it comes time to pay off a renminbi denominated bond, there's a whole lot of different ways that a developer can kind of move money around the organization to kind of find some source of renminbi to pay off that bond. It might be able to take out another bank loan, or it could raise a trust loan, or it can sell more apartments, or it can delay payments to contractors and suppliers. There's always a way to kind of find another source of renminbi. But when it comes to the dollar bond market, it's not easy. There is no other source of dollars. What you really need is permission to exchange the appropriate amount of money into dollars at the right moment. And so it kind of complicates this sort of whole process for developers trying to manage both these onshore and offshore liabilities. Now, the real problem at the moment isn't necessarily for the developers that have defaulted. It's that bondholders of offshore dollar bondholders kind of look at this ecosystem of Chinese private developers. They're going, look, this thing is just going to go from bad to worse. The biggest developer is in huge, second biggest developers in huge problems. We're seeing more and more instances of distress. We're not necessarily sure whether the amount of debt disclosed by these developers is a fair and true reflection of just how indebted they are. In this environment, these bonds that we hold are just not as valuable as they used to be. And so you have this situation where the price of dollar bonds are falling, and they're falling, and they're falling. And that's kind of been creating problems for the developers, because ultimately, as I said before, they don't earn, there's nothing, they're not earning dollars. So the only way that it can actually pay off a dollar denominated bond really is to issue a new dollar denominated bond. And they can't do that in this environment because it's so prohibitively expensive, because the price of bonds have fallen so much. And so that's kind of the conflict that's going on at the moment. That's kind of making things so complicated.
Yeah, sorry. So, but this thing brings up a bigger question, and that I've never sort of understood, although, in some way I do. Okay, so these offshore dollar bonds, but, local governments also sell bonds. these, and apparently starting around 2019, they became hot items. But so you're talking about, I'm just really curious on your thoughts about foreign purchase of these bonds, when these bonds have at most what's called an implicit guarantee. And I'm really curious as to why people are buying these bonds when you say, well, it's the risks are greater, but like, how do they decide which, how much is too much in terms of risk? Because these local government municipal bonds are probably there is no quote explicit guarantee on them.
I'm afraid, Jane, I don't actually have a sense of just how much local governments have raised offshore in the offshore markets. I know local governments themselves, on their own account, haven't done much overseas. I think it might only be Shenzhen, but the local government financing vehicles.
No. But that's what I mean. Via the local government financing companies, they're selling these what are called municipal corporate bonds, and apparently they became really hot items that were being sold, that people bought them. I mean, in some ways, I'm just wondering, how do buyers view those very differently? Because one, they have a direct association with local governments, and these are, well, they're private. A lot of them are private developers. Is that the difference?
There's a couple of comments I can make on that. So first, I'm not sure that the degree to which sort of yields or prices on local government financing vehicle bonds have sort of changed over recently, particularly given what's going on with Evergrande. So I'm not sort of sure how they're being perceived. However, it is worth noting that there is a huge range of quality between local governments. Okay?
Yes, definitely.
So you see this perhaps most clearly in China's interbank market. So stepping away from local governments, but it's a very similar market. So China's banks sell bonds to each other. It's an interbank market. It's a way of ensuring that banks that have lots of deposits are in a position to sort of transfer their largesse to smaller banks that perhaps don't have as robust a deposit base. Now, so all of China's banks are fairly active in, particularly the good quality ones are active in this market. Now, what's kind of happened over the last few years is that traditionally, if you were a AAA rated city or large rural commercial bank, which pretty much means a relatively good quality, relatively large local bank in any given province, that you could sell a bond at an identical yield to any one of your peers in any province. So it didn't matter if you were in Liaoning province or Yunnan or Zhejiang or Jiangsu. If you were AAA rated, you could sell a bond at exactly the same yield. And then what happened was that in early 2019, Baochang Bank got taken over by the financial regulators, and the banks that were holding its interbank debt were forced to take a haircut. Mm-hmm. And what changed is that all of a sudden the market started very much differentiating risk between financial institutions. Now, specifically, and this is the interesting thing in this interbank market, is that they differentiate risk in a very specific way. They differentiate it not necessarily based on the institution, but it's based on where that institution is based, right? So, for example, in most provinces, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Shandong, Hunan, Hebei, most banks in these provinces can still issue debt at exactly the same yield. But if you're from Liaoning, Heilongjiang, Jilin, Inner Mongolia, and a small Gansu, Guangxi, and a small handful of other provinces, you have to pay a premium. And the thing is, that premium, is different for every bank in those provinces. So the interesting thing, this is what's going on here, is that the reason there is that differentiation isn't because investors necessarily look at a bank and go, you're a good bank, you're a bad bank. They look at a bank and they go, you are backed by a good government and you are backed by a not so good government. And this comes back to the question that you raised before about implicit guarantees, that yes, there is still kind of this implicit guarantee. If you're a state-owned enterprise, particularly one that is backed by a provincial government and you're a relatively important state-owned enterprise, then there is the expectation that if push comes to shove and you need support, the local government, the provincial government will step in and help you. However, increasingly the market is recognizing that the implicit guarantee of certain governments is not worth the paper that it's written on. And so you're seeing this differentiation of risk within the market because some implicit guarantees are now recognized as being worth significantly more than others.
Right. Do you know if in the case of Evergrande, because you're pointing out that, you know, ultimately perhaps the province or Shenzhen will step in. Is the debt of a company that is you know, from that locality, is there any kind of implicit or let's put, I guess the correct word is that part of the contingent debt of that locality, even though this is a private company?
No, if it's a private company, there is no expectation that the local government is responsible for it. Now, in earlier times, if it was if it was regarded as being strategically important to the local authorities, or perhaps it was politically connected, then there might be a reasonable expectation that the government might step in. But there certainly isn't. Certainly these days, that, you know, I mean, to the extent that there was an expectation, there really isn't anymore. And certainly, you know, it's more kind of, even traditionally, it was more kind of the choice of the local authorities rather than kind of the expectation that, you know, this is a local government responsibility. I guess it varies from case to case, but I think for the most part, no, private sector firms are, regardless of their size, are not seen as a local government responsibility.
But in this case of Evergrande, and I certainly agree with you that I think that the biggest impact may be on local governments. And so you did, you know, indicate a number of actions that they take. And so they're just doing this for what? Because some of the questions are asking, is it because of, you know, leading to mass unemployment? You know, why are local governments coming in and doing this? Whether it be the you know, developers or otherwise. Okay,
so I think we can divide that question into why Guangdong and Shenzhen will perhaps eventually step in as kind of potentially as a white knight, and why other local governments will specifically mobilize local resources to acquire local projects. Now, on that second issue, there's a couple of reasons, but I think the overarching one is social stability, particularly in such a politically sensitive year, which is, you know, in previous generations, this would have been the leadership transition year. Right. And just because, you know, the top leader isn't transitioning doesn't mean that that a whole lot of other lower level officials aren't moving from one job to another. And so social stability is always the single most important political, you know, imperative. And in this year, perhaps more than usual. So this is about ensuring that, you know, I mean, if we kind of look at the experience of recent years, nothing gives rise to mass protests and unrest than rising property prices, or really anything relating to people's housing. And so there's this sense of, okay, if you've got a whole lot of people in your community who have paid for housing and they're expecting it to be delivered, and they did this and it looks like it's not going to be delivered through no fault of their own, then the best thing to do is to mobilize local resources to ensure that it gets done. Now, in some cases, local authorities are not going to have the resources to be able to do that. In that sort of situation, you will see that perhaps nothing does get done, but local authorities take perhaps a more heavy-handed approach to ensure that that the local community doesn't complain or doesn't get or things don't get too unstable.
Well, here I want to take you back, because these two things, you know, what's happening in property development and local governments, it's so key, as you've already pointed out, but I want to have you elaborate that more, because your answer to this last question actually goes back to the same thing. So, in the end, you are putting essentially the responsibility lands with local government, right? The buck stops there and it's up to them. But at the same time, as you already pointed out, local government revenues are based on essentially land in this thing called land finance. They use land as collateral for borrowing. They flip land and sell it to developers. But given what you've told us about what's happening to the property sector, really, what can local governments do? And also, in the end, how can local governments stop this if in fact they're running out of money? And particularly with COVID, that all of these factors are pointing in this direction. And there are a number of questions have coming in, wondering, one, the fact that you see Beijing doing this and sort of taking over to ensure that it's an orderly sort of transition to make this sort of to reduce the price of housing and such. Is that actually too optimistic of a prognosis?
That is the question. Can they actually pull this off as seamlessly as they would like to? So in terms of what local governments will do, they're already cash strapped. They're looking at losing a major source of revenue. What do they do about it? The sort of things that their starting point is what they're already doing, and what they've always done in this sort of environment is that they ramp up fees and fines. Right. So all of a sudden you get fined for the smallest infraction, fees for parking on the street, fees for visiting a park, they all sort of go up. But at the same time, Beijing has been trying to stop that behavior for years.
Right, exactly.
The other thing,
corruption campaign.
right. I think the other thing to watch for is taxation crackdowns. That every level of government starts to be more strict about tax avoidance. And so whatever taxes that they're entitled to do get collected. But again, this isn't the sort of thing that's going to necessarily replace what has been such a huge and vital source of funding. So people have been talking for years that what really needs to happen is a new a new pact between local governments and the central government, whereby fiscal resources are redistributed more equitably. Beijing gets less, the locals get more, something. But that hasn't happened. We don't seem to be any closer to that happening. And I certainly I haven't seen anything to suggest that there is a new vision of what that might look like, sort of bubbling under the surface. So ultimately, there doesn't seem to be an answer here. I think at some point, given that particularly at the beginning of 2021, the central government started really making noises about how concerned it was about local government, the stresses of local government finances. I think that at some point, I think this year we can only assume that things are going to get worse. And I think the starting point will probably be that, in lieu of a clear vision about what to do about this, the burden, at least in the short term and maybe the medium term, will fall upon the banks. And it's not that the banks will recognize non-performing loans for local governments. They will just accept that they won't be recognized. They will just kind of exist on the bank's books. Now, of course, that creates a whole lot of problems, because when you have a loan that's not generating income, well, you still have to pay your depositors. Banks still have to pay their creditors. And so that creates liquidity problems for the banks. And so that then creates, the central bank, how do they, provide more and more liquidity for the banks to ensure that they can meet their obligations? It creates real problems when the banks don't recognize bad loans. But my instinct is perhaps that's the starting point. that they just quietly are allowed to accumulate on the bank's books. Meanwhile, the banks aggressively write off, dispose of non-performing loans to the property sector, and other parts of the economy, as they have been doing quite increasingly aggressively for the last 5 years. But because there is no solution to the local government debt problem, it falls to the banks.
But in a sense, the other thing that I think they're going to have to do, I mean, you're writing off debt, the local governments are going to have to incur more debt if they're going to do all these things that you've outlined.
Well, yes and no, because the thing is about it, local governments or any level of government in China, they have their budget and they have their official resources, but they then also have other pockets of funds that they can mobilize here and there. And so, they have a stable of state-owned enterprises, and those state-owned enterprises have assets which can be sold off, and they have their own revenue streams. And SOEs can yes, you are right. SOEs can potentially then, if they don't.
But there's a liquidity problem, just as Evergrande had a liquidity problem, and as you were, I think, already suggesting, it would be difficult, particularly if there is a downturn in the economy, to try to sell these assets and get a decent return on them, right? Yeah, they've got assets, but that's not cash.
You're right. And it's a question of just how many steps down the road do we arrive at that point?
Right.
Because, when the value of land assets start falling meaningfully, that has knock-on effects to well beyond what we've been talking about. That massively constrains then the bank of the potential for the ability of the financial system to extend credit. And the reason I say that is because banks, the best way to understand China's banks is that they're glorified pawn shops. They make loans against collateral, right? So you bring in collateral, you get a loan in return. But if you turn, and the collateral that they like more than anything else is land. So if you turn up with a piece of land, the bank will make a loan based on the value of that land, not on the value of your business, not on the cash flow that your business throws off, but the asset that your business owns. Now, the thing is, if land values then fall, then the banks will only be willing to make a smaller loan relative, based on that same piece of land. So of course, if we do end up in an environment where land prices start falling across the board, then the knock-on effects from this, things will potentially get quite hairy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is very difficult, but it's very complicated. I mean, there's not even to mention the fact that in some cases, apparently, the same piece of land is used as collateral for more than one loan. So
apparently, and my understanding is that is not as bad as it used to be. I mean, that used to be rampant, yes. But they now have electronic systems which track all that stuff a lot better. It is kind of, in terms of risk mitigation and transparency in China's financial system, the central bank has made huge strides in the last few years, bringing a whole lot of stuff online, creating platforms and trading platforms. Things are not as bad as they once were, but by the very nature of the system, yes, when things start to unravel, you are going to find that the same asset is being used for the same loans.
Yeah, we also have a question actually coming from Susan Whiting, a scholar who works on land herself. She says, what is your understanding of the new round of property tax experiments to run through 2026? How are they designed and what effects are they likely to have? I'm also very interested in this.
I'm sorry, Jean. I'm afraid I don't have a sufficiently nuanced idea of how that's going to work yet. I mean, it's on my radar, but I just haven't had the time to look into it.
But you've mentioned the experiments, you said in Shanghai, right?
Shanghai and Chongqing have been doing this for years. They were rolled out years ago. I mean, we've been waiting for a nationwide property trial for years and years, in part because Shanghai and Chongqing have been doing it for a long time already. The details of both of those are a little bit different, and I do forget offhand how they do differ. As for the new ones, I'm just not up on.
I think that you and I both agree that the problem is the fiscal system. So I'd love to hear from you. why aren't they doing more? Why don't they just take care of the needed reforms in the fiscal system so there is a more equitable distribution of tax revenues to the localities so they don't have to rely so much on land finance?
I think the short answer is that they don't trust the local governments, and with good reason. I mean, if you kind of look at the, please go on, Jen.
I'm sorry, but I guess that's okay. So what's the, when we say they don't trust the local government, they don't trust the local government with what? With tax revenues?
Well, yeah.
But,
you know,
but they'd rather
them,
have them go off and do this land finance?
well, yeah. I mean, this is what happens. This is the catch-22, right? If you don't give the local governments the resources they need, the local governments find workarounds. But if you give them both the resources and the legal authority to raise, to raise debt for legitimate purposes, at the same time, the local governments have a proven track record of pushing things further than what Beijing permits anyway. So I think the way, my limited understanding is the way Beijing sees things at the moment is under the current system, at least they have a certain degree of control. So when it comes, Beijing collects, the way it works is that in terms of the collection of tax revenue, about 50% gets collected by local authorities, 50% gets collected by Beijing. However, 80% of responsibilities, of spending responsibilities belong to the local governments and 20% to Beijing, which means that funds then get sent from Beijing back to the local authorities. Now, a lot of what Beijing sends back to the local authorities are effectively earmarked, so that when those funds arrive, the local authorities do not have discretion over how that money comes. And I think Beijing likes that because it means that Beijing's got its own priorities. I mean, if you look at how local governments have been spending money over the last few years, it's been on Xi Jinping's priorities, such as more on education, more on improving the environment, more on anti-poverty initiatives. And a way to ensure that is to say, hey, we're going to give you this money, but you've got to use it this way. Now, of course, this is just adds another layer of dysfunction to the system, but there is at least a political motivation behind why the system works this way. As to what a proper functioning system would look like, in this moment, I'm not sure what it would look like, given that the starting point of any solution has to be cleaning up the local government debt. And I don't think Beijing wants to take it on its own books, effectively for the moral hazard issue. It's like, well, okay, we'll take your debt this time, but next time it's not, we won't do it. Well, I think there is this sense that local governments have to take responsibility for a certain, to a certain extent, but there is no clear mechanism or clear route through which they can. So, too many questions at the moment and no clear solution.
Okay, we've got a question that says, how do we compare China to the collapse of the Japanese real estate market?
Gene, I'm probably best to pass on that one because okay. I know just enough about the collapse of Japan's real estate market to be dangerous. So I think I'll.
Okay, no. I mean, I was just that. Yes, that's fine. I was just curious. But
that's a fair question.
Yeah, it's a great question. All right. So do you have, there's also questions, a lot of questions coming in about the variance in how cash strapped are different governments? Are some cities, provinces doing better than others? And I want to add to that. And how does this vary with the amount of property development? Because you were pointing out how this property sector is just really the overbuilt. But even if you do it slowly over time, this is going to be really just huge impact.
Yeah. So in terms of the difference, sort of the distribution of local government distress. Yes, there are differences between provinces, but yes, there are also differences within provinces. So I think it's fair to say at the moment that the most economically vibrant province in the country is probably Zhejiang. Close behind it is Jiangsu and Guangdong. Shandong, which is the other big powerhouse provincial economy, is a greater cause of concern. The PBOC keeps sort of sending it SOPs to just try and help out. But even within those provinces, you do have towns which have massively overextended itself. I mean, in Zhejiang, some of the towns which have been held up as sort of poster children for over indebtedness have been in Zhejiang province. But on a province by province level, I mean, the degree of divergence between the economic prospects in various parts of the country are as great as, or maybe not as great as they ever have been, but they've been diverging rather than coming together. I mean, certainly the central government for years had sort of said, oh, okay, so the Eastern Seaboard developed quite rapidly. Now it's time to help the West, and it's to help the center. And to the extent that those efforts were successful, for a number of provinces, they're going backwards at the moment. So effectively, China's northeast, Liaoning, Heilongjiang, and Jilin are in recession, and they have been for some time. And I mean, we're not just talking about economic problems here, we're talking about real demographic problems, because they're losing their population because young people are moving to other parts of the country where the real opportunities are. Tianjin is another basket case, and this one very much speaks to property overinvestment. I mean, their efforts to build China's Manhattan was just, it was a gross overinvestment of resources, but just not just there as well. I mean, you drive around Tianjin and sort of the excesses are apparent. Some of the biggest corporate and SOE defaults over the last few years have been from Tianjin as well. Elsewhere in the country, bondholders are very worried about Guizhou and Gansu as well, if I remember. Guangxi is also a cause, is a problem is a province that people are worried about. So yeah, there's kind of been a real divergence in the economic prospects of various provinces, and they're not going to get better either, largely because the allocation of credit is favouring those provinces that are going gangbusters. I mean, that's how any market economy would work, and that's what's happening in China. I mean, banks are pouring credit into Zhejiang province and have effectively been leaving the northeast to sort of die on the vine. And you see the PBOC at the moment trying to introduce earlier at the end of last year, they rolled out a monetary tool which specifically provided additional liquidity to 10 provinces where credit growth was particularly weak. Now, that was a particularly new way to allocate liquidity in the system, but it was a recognition that the banking system was not pulling its weight in the sense of allocating credit, distributing it equally around the economy. And what the effects that was happening is exacerbating economic differences between the provinces.
And then finally, we're almost out of time. I just wanted to get your take on whether China might go back to some sort of earlier strategies. As you mentioned, China for a long time has been trying to control housing prices, and they've come up with all sorts of regulations, including things like, these apartments are for living in, not for speculation. And so they put limits on how many apartments you can buy. And if you have a local, hukou or something, that you can only buy if you are there, all of these things. So what about the fact that a way to take care of this is that once again, that Beijing decides that it's more important to keep the economy growing, particularly in this very important year for Xi. And so that they basically just sort of pull back and once again, just take off these restrictions and let people again, use the housing market for investments and making money. And this would also just sort of keep this dynamic of land finance and all these other things that have been driving the economy. They're just going to kick the can down the road further.
That is what we're going to find out this year. And that is, where is Beijing's pain threshold? Just how far are they willing to allow the economy to slow, and how quickly? You know, what is the cutoff point? How much are they willing to accept, and how much won't they? Because the closest thing we've had to what's happening with the property sector at the moment was the deleveraging campaign, which started in 2016, where you saw like a real contraction. The entire section of the financial system shrank. But the difference between now and then is that with the deleveraging campaign, Beijing pretty much got off scot-free, because for the first 2 years, they managed to squeeze leverage out of the financial system. But what they squeezed was the speculation. So they reduced the credit in the system, but what disappeared was kind of this excess cash floating around the system, just going into speculative assets. And so what they're dealing with now is kind of the real world version of what happens when you squeeze the credit out of a sector. And so it's only this year that we're going to get a sense of just where that pain threshold is, and whether this principle of like, we need to fix the way the economy works now, because if we don't do it now, potentially it will be taken out of our hands in the near future, at a moment that where our demographics are not in a position to be able to cope with it, and our financial system is less equipped to deal with it. That is really the trade-off at the moment. Do we do it now, or do we or do we find that we're not willing to take pain and hope that things aren't so bad if and when things happen, of their own accord?
A guess? And your part?
My instinct is that I think what the regulators are going to try and do this year is they want to be able to weaken the property sector while seeing as few developers as possible go bust. So they want to make sure that they've got enough cash to pay their bills. That's the needle they're going to try and thread. And unless, I think if they find that forces that they've unleashed forces that are beyond their control, that they can't thread that needle because home buyers aren't willing to buy pre-sales anymore. People have given up investing in the property market because they don't think prices are going to fall. If all those forces kind of get out of the regulator's control, then I think you will see some backsliding and maybe some panicked moves. But we're not there yet. And I'm, I think it might be touch and go, but so far so good. Not good.
Our time is up, but I want to thank you for engaging all of these questions. I know we've thrown a lot at you, but it's obviously a really important and big topic, and one that we all will follow very closely. Maybe we'll have to have you come back and sort of tell us then the next stage. So thank you very much. And thank the audience for all of your great questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.